Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. Today we're continuing on the trifecta of gameplay. We talked about movement, we talked about wounds/health. Now let us talk about doing damage. Weapons. How do weapons play out in a system? And obviously there are other elements as well. There are things like armor and shields potentially. There are a variety of different factors that also play into suppressing wound damage. But I wanted to start just by talking about weapons, because I think something that defines a game, or should define a game, particularly a historical game, is the distinction between the weapon types that the various combatants were using. And what is fascinating is there hasn't really been, to my knowledge, and here my knowledge is relatively limited, but there hasn't really been any critical analysis of the distinction between the M16 and the AK-47. So one of the things that fascinates me about these two weapons is that they're distinctly different associated with how they do damage. They're distinctly different associated with what they do for incapacitation. They're distinctly different associated with aiming characteristics and a variety of other different factors. But most of the rule sets I see just seem to group them as being the same kind of weapon in a conflict sense, which strikes me as being really very curious. It would actually be far more interesting to have these two weapons distinguished and, the differences, the positives and negatives of both of them played out in a game set with an identified combatants that used, for example, Vietnam, used AK-47s versus M16s. What does that actually mean? What does that actually mean associated with how these units interact, how they take damage, the way in which they, structure their, are they hit and run? Are they hold their ground? What changes the way in which they enact with their combatants, foes? How does the weapon play into that? There's so much potential here for really interesting rule sets and really interesting dynamics based on just how these weapons are different. And certainly in the Second World War, the weapons that the opposing sides used were very distinctly different. Again, you oftentimes see these things grouped together because rule sets fundamentally have to make it certainly interesting, but not maybe too interesting. And certainly when you create your own rules, you have the ability to, if you want to make things too interesting, make things too interesting. Have fun with a rule set. Start exploring these things in a very practical way. Now, if you look at, Dark Ages, if you look at, ancients in terms of the various kinds of weapons that were going up against, combatants, opposing combatants, you would find very curious and interesting distinctions. Now, if you're just dealing with single wound infantry folk slogging it out against one another, maybe the distinctions between, a gladius and, some barbarian sword, not really that important. But if you are looking at smaller skirmish games, it would actually be interesting to see the wounding dynamics take into consideration various weapon dynamics that, rule sets may not attest to. So think associated with the way in which wounds are created as a means of potentially creating very different gameplay elements. And certainly in the fantasy space, this is done in a variety of different ways. But if you consider a group using two-handed weapons, like axes, for example, two-handed axes versus, another group, an opposing group, is using a shield and a sword. The way in which those two interact and the benefits and detriments that they both have based on their weapon type, the wounding component is part of that. So let's talk about this in two parts. The first part is how you actually strike a wound, how you actually get a wound on an opponent. And that oftentimes requires skill-based dice rolls, comparative skill-based dice rolls. It doesn't have to. You can use a variety of dynamics here that aren't necessarily based on skill-based dice rolls. But skill-based dice rolls do seem to be the standard in this space. So you'll have a skill-based dice roll where typically one side rolls a dice, another side rolls a dice. Some impact is determined, and based on that impact, wounds are meted out to the defending unit here. And what's interesting through this is that what one might do is one might look at a variety of different weapon types and just say, okay, in a given turn, this weapon type might inflict a single wound, might inflict 2 wounds, might inflict 3 wounds. There are potential here for this to affect multiple combatants, and that's where it gets very interesting. I mean, oftentimes, multiple wounds just means multiple combatants potentially hit by this weapon. So usually there will be, like I say, two-sided dice rolls, always important. Gets both sides thinking that they're actively contributing to the outcome, which is a very important part of most games. Then you have a circumstance where the wounds are either met or deferred, potentially through armor. These kind of rules as well, I'm just going to put out there as a possibility. We'll talk at greater detail in another recording associated with this, but I think the dynamics here should be relatively easy to be defined. You then have a circumstance where the wounds are held for a period of time, i.e. either the combatant is killed and is removed from the board, or the combatant holds these wounds for a period of time and either loses abilities through the wounding or has some potentially, they don't have to have deteriorative characteristics, but it is an interesting dynamic to add deteriorative characteristics, that after a combatant is wounded a little bit, they might be less likely to do certain things. And how does that actually play out in rules? Again, very few commercial existing rule sets play into this dynamic, but it's an interesting dynamic in house rules to start exploring as you create these games what these kind of interactions could curtail. So let's talk about ranged weapons versus melee weapons. Ranged weapons obviously have some range. They have some specification to hit within that range. Sometimes, an interesting dynamic, I use this in the Just Playing Chaos rule set, I'm going to put it out there. I have 3 different ranges. I have short range, medium range, long range in Just Playing Chaos rule set, with the view that the likelihood to hit in short range is different than medium range, different than long range. And within this means of playing, players can get skilled to improve their abilities to hit in the various ranges, but also it just creates a different dynamic. When you're dealing with a war game where it's 1 wound per infantry soldier, you may not want range dynamics associated with this. You'll just have a maximum range, potential of damage within that. And what's interesting through this as well is that you can create missile weapons that are specifically used for targeting infantry, specifically used for targeting, structures, and other explosive ordinances and these kind of things. I mean, there are so many different dynamics associated with how you actually do damage through a weapon type. And what's fascinating through when I pick up a new set of rules, it's one of the things I gravitate to early on is how is damage actually done? How is damage applied? Is there implications associated with armor? Is there implications associated with various defending techniques? What mitigating roles does an opponent have when they come up against this kind of weapon? And I think what's fascinating through creating your own rules is that you can start exploring a variety of different dynamics, many of which have not been written, many of which I couldn't even speculate about now. But you have the ability to start adding these things, and certainly as I've advocated for early on in these recordings, when you start playtesting this, particularly initially when you playtest against yourself, you'll have a relatively clear indication after a very small period of time how these dynamics will actually play out. One of the beauties of doing self-playtesting initially is that you have an ability to make these slight tweaks, slight alterations. Maybe rather than a D6 worth of damage, a D3 worth of damage, or maybe D3 plus 2, or these kind of things. You can start experimenting with the impact that damage has with all the other components that I have described here as well. And you'll note that there's some sleight of hand here. I've said, well, you've got all this stuff associated with hitting, all this stuff associated with actually enacting wounds. We'll just move that to one side. Let's look at how wounds are taken off. This is because in the early playtesting phases, what you're looking at is unrestrained, worst possible case scenario gameplay. What you're looking for in this circumstance is not the dynamics that lead up to wounds being taken, but just the certainty that certain wounds will be taken. And this you can see, worst possible case scenario, is how short the game will actually play. You've got 2 sides coming together. What is the minimum length of time that this game will exist? And that is a fascinating dynamic to start exploring before you even put on how to actually get to the point where you're doing wound damage. Let's just apply the wound damage as if these rolls were successful, and then let's see how long this battle actually lasts for. And this is the logic associated with me describing these 3 things in the way that I have, is that you get to a point where you can play test the worst possible case scenario, play test a situation where both combatants do their maximum possible damage, and see how long the game will actually last. And that gives an interesting parameter, because what you're looking to do is move from that state to roughly double that state. So the probabilities and the things that you add to gameplay is to move it from the fastest possible scenario, which will typically be ideally 3 to 5 turns, depending on how you structure it, to the best possible, well, to the midpoint of case scenario, which will be roughly double that time frame. And then in the most interesting case scenario, it will typically be triple or quadruple the time frame that you originally came up with. And that's the ideal dynamic that you're looking for. Although there are games that have fixed turn lengths and these kind of things, which you can play. You can put that in your rule set if you want. What interests me is associated with how do you get a gameplay where you can work out what is going to happen with some degree of surety over a parameter of time. So what I've advocated for here, associated with you creating weapons, creating wounding abilities, getting a sense of what the wounding abilities are, is associated with playing out dynamics early on in the gameplay to get a sense of this is the baseline. If everything goes terribly wrong for both sides, this is the length of time that the game will take to play. So I hope I've instilled some ideas in you at least, associated with creating your own rule sets. This, I think, is applicable. These 3 things are applicable to role-playing games, war games, and board games. And the reason that I recorded this in a group of 3 was so that I would have some time to actually talk about using all these techniques with board games. Because I think the board game folk have been pretty long-suffering in this podcast, and that needs to be rectified. If you like what I'm doing here, if you're enjoying what I'm doing here, if I'm motivating any degree of critical thought, please consider telling a friend about this podcast. Please consider posting a link through to this podcast in your social media, ways of getting the podcast out to folk, because My Rules Are Better exists purely because of the listeners. My incentive to record episodes, my incentive to put these ideas out, comes directly from listeners that are getting inspiration from listening to these podcasts. So consider yourself a very important, the most important person, actually, in this podcast series, with the view that your responsibility here is the greatest to bring in other folks that might be interested in what I'm doing here. So hopefully I've motivated through this trifecta of discussion, thinking in your own head associated with rules that you would like to start experimenting with. If you want to get in contact with me, my email address, barbalay@gmail.com. Barbalay is my last name. I'll give it to you in military speak. Bravo Alpha Romeo, Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango. Thank you very much for listening into these podcasts. I'll talk to you soon. Tom Barbalay, what do I say here normally? Tom Barbalay in San Jose, signing out.